when I saw this article, it was actually in City Journal. So the Manhattan Institute is a great conservative think tank in New York, and they've got the City Journal they publish. And in there was an author named Christopher Rufo. And you might know Christopher Rufo. He's the man who began to expose critical race theory and social justice as it rolled through our society a few years ago. And Rufo has this fascinating premise called the Cluster B Society. And of course, this relates to mental illness. So when I saw Cluster B, it piqued my interest. So I thought, let's take this premise that he's got of a Cluster B society, and let's think about, the biblical reality behind that. So with every lesson, we begin with a key verse, and this one is Romans 1:22. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. And so that verse very much applies to where we are today. The Cluster B Society, background behind it, we're going to try to peel that onion. We're going to try to understand what the author is coming from. And we're also going to look at the pathocracy that he is positing exists in our country. So that's a new word for me. A pathocracy is a government, a form of leadership, a form of management that is filled with pathologies. And in this case, we're talking mental illness. We're talking pathologies related to Cluster B illnesses. And so that's a very interesting idea. And then we'll talk about mostly college campuses today. We're really focusing in because of all the protests we've seen and because of the interview on the House of Representatives, the interview with the college presidents. We thought we really wanted to kind of understand the root cause of that behavior. So we'll talk about that, and then we'll talk about the Christian response. So it's important because our society loves to redefine terms that we understand what we're talking about when we say mental health and mental illness. And so mental health is anything that really relates to care for someone who has a mental condition, a mental disorder. And when you're talking mental health, you really are focused mostly on milder forms of mental illness. You're talking about depression, you're talking about anxiety. But when you get into the term mental illness, that's when you're really looking at more severe forms of illness. So you're talking about major depression, you're talking about schizophrenia, OCD, other things like that. And so 1 in 5 Americans, I thought this was a fascinating stat, 1 in 5 Americans suffer from some form of mental illness. So throughout your life, whether it's depression or anxiety or other things, and it's pretty common, actually. And if you look back through Scripture, you'll see David, in some of his Psalms, appears to be suffering from depression. You'll see Elijah climb up under a bush. He appears to be suffering from depression. Anxiety, throughout Scripture. And then you see even men like Charles Spurgeon. And you don't think of a godly man like that, a man that we call the Prince of Preachers, having been suffering from that kind of illness, but he did. And this is Christopher Rufo. Like I said, his hypothesis is that our society is sick, that our institutions are compromised, and that a cluster of mental disorders seems to be on the rise in our country. And what he's doing is he's looking at the protests in the major cities. He's looking on the college campuses. He's looking at the behavior in Congress. And he's saying these behaviors are all consistent with a group, a cluster of mental disorders. And he tries to pin that to the late 60s, 70s era when Dr. Spock began to write his books about child rearing, and we shifted our focus from discipline to self-esteem, and we began to raise generations of narcissistic children, which then became narcissistic parents, some narcissistic parents. And that culture of narcissism is what he believes is now creating the psychodrama that we're watching on TV. I thought it would be valuable for us to kind of dive into the diagnostic manual for just a few minutes. I don't want to bore you, but when you say cluster B, you're really talking about a group of mental disorders. So cluster A is paranoid behavior, schizophrenic behavior. It's not really what we're looking at. Cluster B is borderline personality disorder, narcissism, the narcissistic personality disorder, histrionic, and then antisocial. And so we'll cover just a few of the characteristics of each of these, just so you can have an idea of why the author believes we are where we are. So borderline is the most commonly studied mental disorder. And someone who's borderline, as you can see there, is characterized by unstable moods, intense moods, angry outbursts. They see the world as black and white. And then if you go down to narcissistic personality disorder, I think most of us are familiar with how a narcissist behaves. In fact, some of you may have some in your families or some friends. But there is a sense of entitlement in attention seeking. They're typically arrogant and haughty. And then histrionic, so that's not hysterical. We're not talking about someone who's hysterical. The root of that word is think of an actor on the stage, and he is overplaying his role. So someone who's histrionic is acting a role in public. So it's exaggerated behavior. They overreact to the smallest events. They don't have relationships because of that behavior. And then something I thought was interesting, they have strong opinions without knowledge. So they form these rock-hard opinions on things, but they have no knowledge behind it. And I think that kind of behavior we're seeing a lot of. And then antisocial, that's really where we see the psychopaths and the sociopaths in our society. And I saw a stat from the FBI. They said that, and this was a few years ago, they said that 4% of the American population was sociopathic. That's a huge number. It doesn't mean that they all act out, that they all are violent. I actually have a friend, and she adopted 2 children, both from Romanian orphanages. And they were never touched for a year. They were simply bottle fed. And both of them grew up to be sociopathic. They had no ability to have emotions or empathy. She had to teach them the appropriate way to respond in society, to mimic those feelings. And so a sociopath is very adept at feigning emotion, but they don't have it. And high-functioning ASPDs, they can actually be witty and charming. So think some of these mass murderers that convinced women that they were just awesome. Ted Bundy is a great example. So sparkling personality. Cluster B behavior, thinking that goes along with cluster B behavior, has serious real-world consequences. And we've talked about these stats, but I thought we needed to see them again. High schoolers who contemplated suicide increased by 25% from 2009 to 2017. Self-harm has increased by 62% since 2009. So these are all young girls. These are teenage girls cutting themselves and doing other things. More than 50% of young people reported sadness, anxiousness, anger, and guilt over climate change. And no matter how you feel about climate change, you can't deny the reality of these emotions and how that affects their ability to function in society. And then the worst step is no belief in a calling higher than their own identity. So this is the generation of the nuns, no religious affiliation. Gen Z has completely walked away from God. If there's nothing higher than your own identity, then you're in serious trouble. And that is a key factor in suicide ideation. So this is the pathocracy. So that's not my word, it's his. But he looks at people that are elevated to positions of power and authority. It could be in the executive branch, it could be in Congress, it could be in business. But he's seeing narcissistic behavior, he's seeing borderline behavior, and antisocial traits. And then he talks about the use of emotional blackmail, virtue signaling, and then theatrical accusations. So everyone is Adolf Hitler. Everyone is a Nazi by disagreeing with me. So this kind of histrionic behavior he's seeing in leadership in these institutions. And everyone is impacted. So government, you see it in business, you see it in the medical field, academia, and arts and entertainment. And the only common factor here, because like I said, he doesn't know the root cause of these behaviors, but he does see that the university appears to be the replication site. So children come in one end, and when they go out the other end, they're exhibiting these behaviors. That's his premise. So how is that possible? How would that actually happen on a college campus? And a lot of us, when we think about college, we think about good experiences from the past. We think about our alma mater. We think about how great things were and, how much fun we had. So the modern college campus does not look that way anymore. So mission creep is taking the mission of these colleges and changing it around entirely. So it's no longer a place where you challenge the preconceptions of students. It's no longer a place where you cause them to see the world from a different perspective and challenge their viewpoints. It's now a world where you create safe spaces. So the most important priority of some of these Ivy League colleges is to create bubble-wrap children. And those safe spaces are so protected that even words are deadly. Words are dangerous. You're killing me with words. Any words I disagree with have to be removed. And so they're requesting removal of material because it's triggering to them. And then unpopular speakers are either canceled beforehand or they're canceled with the actual heckler's veto. So the heckler's veto, they show up in a conference room or auditorium, and when the speaker begins, they're shouted down, they're insulted, and they have to leave. And the best example I can think of here is actually at Stanford Law, where they brought in a federal judge to talk to the students, and he couldn't get a word out. They were screaming, they were yelling, they were waving signs. And when someone from staff actually finally got there, it was the DEI chair, and she came up to the podium, and then she railed on the speaker and said his presence was a threat to them, and his words were violence. And so he actually left. So this is happening in many more places than Stanford. And so some students, and we know because we've seen the interviews, are resorting to what they call defensive self-censorship. So if you can't have open dialogue, you just shut your mouth. And you got a whole generation of students that are just going through college with their mouth shut. So not just a poisonous environment, but we're seeing a poisonous curriculum. And we've talked about that in this class. We've talked about the Frankfurt School. And when it came to America, so the Nazis kicked the scholars out of the Frankfurt School. They landed at Columbia University. So Columbia gave them a place to begin teaching cultural Marxism. And from that point, it spread out throughout academia in the country. And so it typically began in social sciences and arts and humanities, and in legal studies. So critical legal theory is a Marxist-based theory. But today you don't see quite as many overt Marxist classes, but you see Marxism baked in now. And so anytime you're talking about post-colonialism, anti-neoliberalism, gender, race studies, what we call grievance studies, social justice, feminist studies, all those have Marxist thought patterns within them. Intersectionality, critical race theory, and Marxism. And so the hard sciences, which we thought would be immune to this phenomenon, are now being attacked. So math is seen as rooted in white supremacist patriarchy, at least at Brooklyn College. So the hard sciences are under attack. Medicine is under attack. So the Association of American Medical Colleges is now asking medical schools to focus on healthcare equity and the disruption of dominant narratives. So this is straight out of the critical race theory playbook. And then 43% of social science and humanities professors call themselves radicals. So they're happy to label themselves that. So it is a poisonous environment. It's a poisonous curriculum in many of these schools. And that poison is creating an irrational hatred. And so some DEI offices and the policies and procedures they're enacting in these colleges, combined with that poisonous curriculum, is creating this worldview. And the worldview is oppressor versus oppressed. And that is textbook intersectionality. So if you're Jewish, you're passing white, meaning you appear to be white. You're very prosperous, you're successful, you do well in school, therefore you cannot possibly be oppressed. Despite what the Jewish people have suffered throughout their history, you couldn't possibly be oppressed. You're not black or brown. And so we're seeing that play out in the way that Jewish students are now treated on campuses. And the testimony, Harvard, MIT, and the University of Pennsylvania presidents, when they came in to talk, what struck me most about that testimony was that it was just a basic lack of a moral compass. It was a lack of basic humanity. If you cannot say that calling for genocide is evil and wrong and will be stopped, you have a serious problem. You've drunk the Kool-Aid, the intersectionality CRT Kool-Aid. And this disastrous mix of all these things, combined with anti-Semitism, which really has been percolating on some of these campuses for decades, caused what we're actually seeing now. So Brandeis did a study, and you can see on the very bottom there, they highlighted the highest anti-Semitic hostility in U.S. colleges, and the list is there, Columbia near the top. And so that's bad enough, and I don't know how in the world we come back from that. But it gets worse, because what's happening in our colleges today is they're teaching illness. And what do I mean by teaching illness? So the University of Michigan did a Healthy Minds study. And in that study, they identified 60% of college students meet the criteria for at least one mental health problem. And that's a 50% increase over a decade. It's a 50% increase. And you can see some of the cognitive distortions on the right. And I can't go through all these, but these distortions connect back to those cluster B illnesses. So if you are histrionic, you're going to exhibit some of these ways of thinking. All or nothing, overgeneralization, mind reading. So trigger warnings, trigger issues, I'm triggered by the very least thing, is really tied to me understanding what you think about me and being triggered by your behavior, rather than giving someone the benefit of the doubt. Mind reading, like we said, catastrophizing. The world will end tomorrow if we don't do X. The world will end in 10 years if we don't do X. Yeah. Emotional reasoning. So all of these cognitive distortions link back to those cluster B illnesses. And when you go to a therapist, when you go to a psychologist, and they sit down with you and they try to help you to understand that these are bad ways of thinking, that these have bad outcomes, what that's called essentially is cognitive-based therapy. So CBT works. When you challenge someone's, say for instance, catastrophizing, when you challenge that something's going to happen in a year or 5 years or 10 years, it helps people break out of that thought. It helps them break out of that way of thinking. So I believe it's a very productive way of interacting with folks. And they gradually expose people to fears, things that they don't like, things that they fear. CBT gradually exposes them to that. It makes them stronger, it makes them more resilient. But what's happening on our campuses as we're bubble wrapping children and creating safe spaces is they're actually using CBT in reverse. Rather than exposing kids to things that might challenge them or they might be fearful of, we're isolating them from those things. We're reinforcing their fragility. And we do that, we're exacerbating these cognitive distortions. We're causing them to think in these ways, and to think worse in these ways, perhaps, than they did before they entered college. So Professors, when they stand up and they teach things like catastrophizing or black and white thinking, all or nothing thinking, they are passing on to their students their own mental disorders. They're passing on to their kids their own incorrect or damaging or dangerous ways of thinking. So we're actually teaching illness in some of these colleges. And then we always talk about gender because we think it's a very important topic. God created men and women, and he expects us to stay in the bodies that we were created in. And gender dysphoria is a serious issue. It's a serious mental health issue, but it's a serious sin issue. And so this stat we've used before is in Abigail Schreier's book, Irreversible Damage. But she said that gender dysphoria has increased by 1,000% over the last decade. So that's not an extra zero, that's 1,000%. So 2% of all high schoolers now believe that they are transgender. And in this discussion, it's important to be able to differentiate between gender dysphoria, which is a diagnosed condition. The DSM manual talks about it. If you're gender dysphoric, then as a child, you'll be exhibiting symptoms. And those symptoms, by the end of puberty, they're gone, right? That confusion is gone. So that's gender dysphoria. But self-identification as transgender is not the same thing. So the vast majority, 80% of people that call themselves trans, have not been to a psychologist. They've not been to a doctor. They've not been to a counselor to help them understand that. So that self-identification, Dr. Lisa Littman, who's done a lot of work on the topic, she's actually not that popular now because of her findings, her recent findings. But she created a term, it's called rapid onset gender dysphoria. So essentially, it's gender dysphoria that does not have to be tied to any symptoms, to any pre-existing symptoms. You don't have to be diagnosed by anyone. You're just now another gender. And in her mind, as a mental health professional, she believes it is a cultural contagion, that it is exacerbated by social media, and that it's fed by mainstream media and even parental reinforcement. So this is an entire generation of kids who are saying they're something that they're not, and they're being reinforced by every source of authority in their lives. What she believes is that it could be narcissistic behavior on the part of parents that's forcing their children to identify this way. So how did we get here? And the author didn't take the time to go through the individual steps, and we don't really have the time today to go through all these. But if you look at the academic track, you can see that indoctrination that we talked about. You can see the rise of CRT and gender ideology, DEI offices being stood up. You can see mission shift on the part of the colleges. Safetyism is the new term. So colleges are now engaged in safetyism. You must all be safe. We must remove any stimulus that might make you angry. And then academic intolerance, and what we're calling ideological implementation. So ideas have consequences. If you teach someone something, they're going to act out in a way consistent with what they're taught. So that's what we're seeing on college campuses. And then entryism. So when they leave college and they go into business and they go into government, they carry these ideas with them. No, they don't grow out of them. We see a lot of CEOs today in corporations that picked their ideas up in the 60s, and they did not grow out of them. And then the cultural track at the bottom, that's just bad parenting, transmission of trauma, peer group influence, social media influence. So those things all kind of sit together in a big poisonous stew that kids pass through. And add the social media accelerant at the end of that, and what you've got is what we're witnessing today. So let's talk for just a minute about the spiritual aspect. We haven't really brought Scripture in. And so I thought what we would do is take those personality disorders and lay them side by side with Scripture and take a brief look at the behaviors compared to Romans 1. So we talk about Romans 1 a lot. Romans 1 represents basically God judging man over and over and over again. And the final step in Romans 1 is being given over to what God calls a debased mind. Some translations call it a reprobate mind. And the reprobate mind or debased mind is characterized by the behaviors that you see on the right. And that includes envy, murder, deceit, insolence, haughtiness, boastfulness, heartlessness, ruthlessness, all these behaviors. And I didn't do a one-for-one mapping, but compare those behaviors to the behaviors of cluster B disorders. And what you'll find is a very close correlation. And that's what makes us believe that what we're witnessing around us is actually God's judgment. That's God's judgment as based on Romans 1 for the sin that our country is engaged in for many decades and for turning our back on God. So some mental health conditions, as we said, they're physiologically driven. Some sociopaths are born as sociopaths. And some people have gone through serious trauma that's no fault of their own. So mental health and mental health conditions aren't necessarily tied to sin. But this sudden explosion in our society of cluster B behavior, I believe, is tied to sin. And in Romans 1, as you read through there, you'll see that God releases his restraints on society. And you'll see 3 times in that chapter it says God gave them up, right? So any restraints that God exercised were removed. And he removed common grace as well. So common grace includes things like logic and reason and civil discourse, common sense, all those things and many others that God gives in a society have been removed. And then God blinds those who choose not to see. 2 Thessalonians 2, 10 through 12. Because they refuse to love the truth and so be saved, therefore God sends them strong delusion so that they may believe what is false. All right, this is our last chart. The first bullet there is from Rod Dreher in his book, The Benedict Option. And he's a very prescient thinker. I love Rod Dreher. He thinks a lot about culture and Christianity and where we are today. And he says that we are the remnant in the time of judgment. We are experiencing exile in place until God delivers us. So we are, in fact, the remnant. We're the Church of Jesus Christ. We are the vast minority in this society and in this world. And we are living in a time of judgment. I don't think anyone can argue that we're not. But we're in exile in place until God himself delivers us. So the ability to deliver ourselves and our society out of this mental health explosion, mental illness explosion, does not exist within our own hands. And so just 3 points here. There is no silver bullet to stop this. But there are 3 things that we should always be doing. And one is actively fighting against and repenting of our own besetting sins. So reformation, restoration, all those things start within the church. And they start within our own hearts. Judgment begins in the house of God. So we need to be walking every day, loving God with our whole heart, repenting of the sin that's actually taken us captive, and getting rid of those idols that we've built in our hearts. And then we have to preach the gospel. The gospel truly is the only solution to what we're witnessing around us. And we need to pray for God's mercy. And then as Christians, so in this country we also happen to be citizens. And we also happen to have a great number of rights that we can exercise the way that Paul did. And so we have to oppose this ideological poisoning on our campuses. We need to oppose this spread of mental illness within the colleges and support Christian schools. So we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can attempt to repair these institutions And then we can also support getting children into Christian schools, which I think is extremely important. And we may actually in the future have an opportunity to engage in something like that. Hopefully we will.